Hello, it's a pleasure to be here at VeetConf 2024, talking about magically optimizing your fonts. My name is Daniel Rowe. I am a full-time open source developer. I lead the Nuxt core team. I am also part of a number of other projects like Nitro in the UnJS ecosystem, like Elk, which is a client for Mastodon, and some others as well, like Fontaine or Magic Regexp. And you can check out a few of those um, on the screen. I also have a website, which is row.dev. And you can find out more about what I'm involved with and getting up to there, as well as find out my details to drop me a line. Feel free to message me if there's anything I can do to answer any questions you have as a result of this talk, or if you just want to talk about something else too, that's fine also. I'm based in Edinburgh in the UK, although I'm not originally from here. This is my cat, Barley, who does her best to keep me from being productive, which is excellent. And this is her normal position. Right now, she's on the bed behind me and sleeping, and hopefully that will continue for the duration of this talk. So I could talk a little bit about Veet's philosophy, at least as far as I see it, and that will obviously be a partial picture. But one of the things I love about Veet is how polymorphic it is. Veet takes the position of one being very good for end users. So if someone just wants to build a project on Veet, it's a phenomenal experience. So you can get going with Vue, you can get going with React, and Veet makes that incredible. You don't need to be using a framework built on top of Veet at all. But Veet is also very much ideal for a framework author, for people who want to build on top of it. And I honestly think that's one of the things that's brought us all here today, that we have so many people from so many different frameworks and backgrounds and libraries all using and building on top of Veet. And the openness of the core team to that is what makes that possible. And honestly, I think there are lessons in general for a lack of egoism in open source that we could all draw from the Veet team. And for example, I could talk about how we were able to re-implement public asset loading in Nuxt as a result, in order to support a feature that we have in Nitro, which is the idea that you can have multiple public folders, each with their own rules for caching, each with their own rules for a base URL, and so on. And we were able to re-implement that fully, even though this is a feature that Veet provides public asset resolving. We might be able to port that upstream back to Veet if there's a desire for that. We're able to re-implement chunk loading errors and handle that at the framework level, working in collaboration with the Veet team, which is amazing. And we recently rebuilt our WebSocket handling to be able to share the same port for our dev server and Veet's WebSocket. And there are lots of things like that I could point to. And I could give a whole talk about that. But today I just want to pick one thing to talk about to showcase what Veet is able to enable us to do at Nuxt. And that is the challenge of web fonts. Now, if you might say that web fonts aren't challenging, it's simple. You just have to paste a couple of links into your index.html, or however you add head metadata in your website, and you're good to go. But it's not quite that simple. I mean, that's possible. You can make things a little bit better by downloading the fonts and putting them in your public directory, but it's not quite that simple. Here's one reason why. So I don't know if you spend some time optimizing your website with for your core web vitals, you should. And you'll notice that among those, largest contentful paint, interaction to next paint, those are key. But one of the things that web fonts particularly struggle with is cumulative layout shift. And that is because when you load the font, it can cause a readjustment of the layout of the site. And here are a couple of different ways that might look based on your font display choice. So if you have a blocking font, you will have the font come in later, maybe as soon as the font files have loaded, and that is definitely a big issue for last contentful paint. So you might not want to do that. You might want to do something like font display swap, which is default for Google Fonts, for example, and you'll get a behavior a little bit like this. So your font comes in, and then it swaps across to a different font, and that causes this sort of feeling of jank as the user looks at your website. And you might also say, well, let's Rather than swapping, between Times New Roman and Poppins, let's actually provide a native fallback, something like sans serif or UI sans serif, and you can have a whole list. Tailwind has a good example, and you get something which feels a little bit better, but it's still this sort of movement on the screen. And this is probably as simple as it gets. This is not changing the number of lines, but you can actually find when there's a difference between your custom web font and your system font that actually the whole page changes because 2 lines turns to 3, and that's multiplied across the whole page. And that's bad experience for users. They can't click a button because it moves around, and it just feels bad too. And you'll get worse performance scores as a result. And I mean, I could give that as an example of anything else. There's Open Sans, that's what that looks like. Maybe it's a bit better. You might pick something which is really similar to your site, Roboto, maybe quite similar, and it's not going to adjust quite so much. But that's requiring manual fine tuning. There are a number of solutions that people have adopted to try and solve this problem. So you can inline fonts as data URIs. That's actually bad. It's not cacheable. It really increases the initial load of your HTML. Can subset fonts. It's not scalable. You have to do that manually and really only works for sort of headlines where they're not changing. Can preload fonts. It's not performant. You don't know what fonts will be used on any given page. You might end up having to preload lots and lots of different versions of the font for italics, bold, different languages. Again, they might not all be used, and it blocks your site, so it makes it slower in appearance to your users. And one of the things that we've jumped on is font metrics. So all credit here to Katie Hempenius, who's at Google. Do check her out. She's a great engineer. And her approach is basically to take certain characteristics of fonts and use those characteristics to calculate some CSS properties: size adjust, ascent override, descent override, and line gap override. And we can actually calculate those based on 2 fonts. So take the web font you want to display, and then take the system font that's going to display until it loads. And you can basically force one font to take up the same amount of space as the other. So this is a little bit of what we would do. For example, between Poppins and Arial, we could calculate these kind of ascent overrides, descent overrides. And you get something then that's like this. So that. So let's switch it off, try again. So this is what we would get natively. But with custom metrics, we can get something like this. So it does adjust, of course, they're different fonts, but barely. It's much less perceptible. Whereas again, this is the behavior if you're just swapping. So it's an immediate benefit, and it's just a few lines of CSS. So we were able to make that I was able to make that repeatable by taking this great idea, which wasn't mine, and building it on top of some metrics from an amazing project called Capsize, which actually exists to solve a slightly different problem in font CSS. But they made available metrics for all kinds of different fonts, Google fonts particularly. So taking the metrics from their project, we're able to wrap that in Unplugin. If you haven't come across it, it's a project by Anthony Fu, which makes it possible to easily write plugins that work in any bundler from Rollup to Vite to Webpack. And that whole thing meant we were basically able to inject into any CSS file the necessary fallbacks to make CSS with web fonts more performant. If you haven't come across it, check out Fontaine. So Fontaine is the result of this work, and it's a bundler agnostic tool that generates pure CSS, so it's build time only, with 0 runtime overhead, and it immediately improves web font performance on the cumulative layout shift by injecting those font metrics wherever your fonts are used. So that's usable today. There's another project that I'm just making open source today called Unifont, which is a way of accessing font provider APIs like Google Fonts, FontSource, and many others in an agnostic way from code. So rather than having to parse their responses or write custom handlers for these different providers, there's a single way to do it. And then, on top of these 2 open source projects, which can be used by anybody, we built Nuxt Fonts. So Nuxt Fonts aims to totally get rid of the pain of any kind of web font optimization. So you don't have to configure anything. it's privacy first, and it is performance optimized. And this is why. This is how it works. So you write some CSS. So this is a view file, and you can do this in your view file. You can do it using Tailwind, Uno CSS, or just a normal CSS file. It doesn't matter. But basically, when Nuxt Font spots that you have this font family in your CSS anywhere, it knows to do a couple of things. And here's what it does. First, it changes the declaration to add this a special fallback font face, which is how we can automatically determine the metrics based approach I talked about earlier. And this uses Fontaine under the hood. Then in front of that usage, it injects a font face definition from any one of the providers. So it basically searches through the providers from Google to FontSource, so on. I think we have 7, and even a local provider. So if you stick a file called this in your public directory, it will find that too. It creates the font face declaration for you. It adds the Unicode range or the font weight or whatever else is required. It actually produces lots of these. So it gives you your italic version and your bold version and so on, and for different Unicode ranges as well. And it downloads the font from wherever it is located. So whether that's in Google or whether that's some other CDN or a custom font provider, and make sure it's in your project. It's cached, so it doesn't actually go into your Git repo, and you don't download it more than once, but it will be part of your build output. So it will go into your public folder when you build. And that means that there's no privacy concern because you're not heading a third party. You also don't have to pre-connect or connect to like a third-party origin. It's just part of your site. And for Nuxt users, they also benefit from caching. So if they're deploying to a CDN-based provider like Vercel or Netlify or Cloudflare Pages, it's cached as part of the CDN there, and it becomes incredibly fast. It's also handled like an asset in your Vite build, so you can get automatic preload behavior if that's what if that's what you want to have in your project. Again, I advise against preloading fonts because you might have a lot of font files and it's not turned on by default. But we also generate that fallback CSS that enables the font to load in without much shift. And we have quite a lot of interesting things on the roadmap, including support for different font weights and producing fallbacks that exactly match the weights of the fonts that you have, or even the ability to directly compute the specific letters used in key value propositions like a heading or something like that, and create something which is just ideally subsetted and targeted for that. Now, all of this is only possible because it's happening at build time, because it's deeply integrated with Vite and we're able to see like what the user is using. We're able to take control of public assets and how they work. We're able to do things like fetch from public APIs using Unifont and download them. And the whole experience from a developer's point of view is pretty cool. So I'm really excited about that. Now, I'd love to show you what it's like to use as a user. So I fired up a Nuxt project here. We're all ready to go. Let's just start our dev server. And the experience, of course, with getting started with Nuxt is that you have a dev server running. You can do a lot of things through DevTools. So in this case, I'm going to go to my modules tab and install the Nuxt Fonts module. So here we go. It's going to install it and add it to my Nuxt config file. And that's done. So I now have the fonts module, and I can switch. I have a DevTools tab, which I'll see some cool stuff with in a moment. But again, it gets going not because I interact with it, but just because I write some CSS. So this is what I might want to do. I might want to add a little line here, which says, hello, ViteConf. And we'll add a style. And we'll write a, I can write CSS. We'll write some stuff. So you might have color red or something like that. And that should be displaying in my browser. There we go, hello ViteConf. And now if I make some changes to that, like if I add font family, let's just add pop and say, boom. And what happens is in the browser, in the background, we have a request now to this hash that I talked about, which is the actual Poppins font. And that is being cached now in my local project. So it's in a cache folder. You can't see it in Node modules. And when I build my project, that's going to become part of the build, and that font file and some others as well will be added into the public folder, and it will be possible when you deploy it for those fonts to be part of your site. And all the rest that I talked about, the font fallbacks and so on, it's all happening in the background. So if I were to say, for example, that Poppins is my first choice, but maybe Arial is my second choice, then what's going to happen here is that the fallback is going to be calculated relative to Arial for me. So I could have a look actually at the generated CSS if you want to see that. And you can see all of this. The metrics are added, the normal font, the ones from Google Fonts are injected here, and the whole thing is wrapped up, ideally so that users don't have to spend any extra work making their websites performant and implementing web fonts. So there we go. A super brief overview of what it's possible to do with Vite. If you're interested, please do check out the docs on nuxt.com or fonts.nuxt.com. You can follow Nuxt on Twitter or Mastodon, or you could follow the other people on the Nuxt team, would be great. And we have a Discord server, chat.nuxt.com, so feel free to join and chat about any of this. And a final offer, if you do want to book 10 minutes of time to have a quick chat with me, I'd love that. If there's anything I can do to help you or help you get started in open source, particularly if this is something that's quite foreign to you, or you think, the people you see contributing to some of these projects don't really seem a lot like you, then I would love to tell you that you'd be really welcome. So do book a call. I'd love to talk about it. It's been a real pleasure to be here today. So thank you for having me. And I'm really looking forward to some of the rest of the talks we have today. So all the best.